Thank you very much, Professor Neate. It's always great to have colleagues who make your ego expand and expand in their introduction. So thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'd also like to echo Francis's comments concerning our hosts, KMI. You couldn't have done a finer job of putting on the workshop, but also in hosting us. So thank you profoundly for that. What I'd also like to start by saying is that I am a geographer by training, but I've hung around lawyers possibly too much for my own health and ended up with an LLM as well. So I take a geospatial or technical perspective on the law of the sea. And what I'd like to do is build on, and I'm going to relish this bit, Professor Hanich's presentation from yesterday. Quentin was promoted, I think, in the last round of promotions at University of Wollongong, and I'd like to congratulate him. It's the first time I've actually been able to say Professor Hanich in anger. So well done, Quentin. Build on his comments around the centrality, the primacy of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea as our overarching legal architecture for oceans governance, and in particular, the zonal aspects of the convention. So I'm going to talk a little bit about baselines, limits, and boundaries, and the incomplete nature of the maritime political map of the world, some of the obligations contained in the provisions of the convention that are relevant to this, how that connects to particularly the I in IUU fishing, determining what fishing is happening where, in whose jurisdiction, and therefore whether it's legal or illegal in character. And again, returning to the convention, some of the obligations within the relevant provisions related to conduct of states within areas of overlapping maritime claims or disputed waters. And there are a couple of cases that are relevant to that discussion, and that leads us to issues around provisional arrangements of a practical nature. So fundamentally, there's an axiom in the international law of the sea that the land dominates the sea. And I think Prosper Weil put it very well here, that the land dominates it, but it dominates it through the medium or the intermediary of the coastal front. It's the coastal front that is critical. But first, to assert claims to maritime jurisdiction offshore, one must have sovereignty over land territory. And I'll come back to threats to that status of land territory as we progress. But from baselines along the coast of your land territory, then we generate claims to maritime jurisdiction offshore, the zones that Quentin talked about yesterday, the territorial sea, contiguous zone, exclusive economic zone, 12, 24, and 200 nautical miles, limited from baselines along the coast, and then the continental shelf and potentially the extended or outer continental shelf seawards of 200-mile limits. Now, not all of our baselines along the coast are relevant to the determination or delineation of the outer limits to maritime claims. So if we take this coastline and we take a number of base points, usually the seaward most protuberant parts of the coast, the vast majority of maritime states are interested in maximizing their maritime claims, and so they define an envelope of arcs. And taking the outermost parts of the arcs, be they 12 nautical miles, 24 nautical miles, or 200 nautical miles distant from the baselines, then we generate the maximum area of territorial sea contiguous zone or exclusive economic zone. What that tells us is that parts of our baseline, on an embayment, for example, don't contribute to the outer limits of maritime claims. There is an older way to generate the limits of maritime claims called the Trace-Parallel method. I don't think it's in use by coastal states. It's really taking the shape of the coastline and transposing it the given distance offshore. But it doesn't provide the maximum maritime claim for coastal states, so it's not especially popular. Baselines are also fundamental to maritime boundary delimitation between states, and there is no coastal state in the world that doesn't have at least one maritime boundary to delimit with neighboring states. The extension of maritime claims seaward, from the traditional cannon shot rule of 3, or in Norway's case, 4 nautical miles territorial sea, because Norway always claimed that they had better cannon than everyone else, to 12 nautical miles, plus the introduction of the 200 nautical mile limited EEZ, means that every coastal state has maritime neighbors up to 400 nautical miles distant from baselines. Now, the provisions of the convention dealing with maritime delimitation for EEZ and continental shelf don't prescribe a particular method of delimitation, but in practice, the vast majority of maritime boundaries are delimited on the basis of equidistance, the middle line, the geometrically center line between opposing coasts. Now, the connection here to illegal fishing in particular is there are obligations within the convention for publicizing the delineation of outer limits and the position of baselines, the position of maritime boundaries. But transparency over those aspects, baselines, limits, and boundaries, actually enables the global community, maritime users, to determine where fishing activity is taking place, whether it's taking place within what zone. And Quentin yesterday talked about transboundary fisheries. Well, yes, inherently we are talking about transboundary fisheries, but we need to know where the boundaries are so that we can determine in which maritime jurisdiction the activity is taking place. And that's critical from the point of view of coastal states that Quentin was talking about in terms of income and preserving those exclusive sovereign rights over maritime zones, particularly EEZ and continental shelf, within which there are valuable marine resources. Now, the obligations, and I'm now doing what I accuse my legal colleagues of and criticize them harshly for putting far too many words on a page of PowerPoint. However, when you deal with the convention, you do have to quote from it on occasion, and there are obligations on coastal states to publicize the location of their declared baselines. Particularly that refers to Article 7, strait baselines, Article 9, river closing lines, Article 10, bay closing lines, and also for archipelagic states, the location of archipelagic baselines around the coast. In the context of the delimitation of maritime boundaries for territorial sea and for both continental shelf and exclusive economic zone, again, there are obligations on the coastal state to publicize the location of boundary lines. How states do this? They tend to submit geographical information, coordinates, charts to the UN Secretary General through the Division of Ocean Affairs and Law of the Sea. So there are clear obligations under the convention that this should take place. Unfortunately, I looked at this morning and counted up how many states had actually done so. We have 152 coastal states around the world. 88 have made declarations and deposited information, and most of them only partially so for their baselines, limits, and boundaries. Many states simply make ambit claims. They claim jurisdiction over a 12 nautical mile limited territorial sea, a 200 nautical mile limited exclusive economic zone, without defining the limits of those claims. There is a shift that's taking place. There's been a movement towards more declarations through DOLOS to the UN Secretary General, but the motivator for that is not only protecting sovereign rights over maritime spaces, but it's also driven by concerns over sea level rise. And I'll demonstrate how that is the case, particularly for the small island states of the Pacific. Here's one example, and applause to Indonesia here, of a state that is explicit in where its maritime claims are limited by, proximate to its neighbors. Now, Indonesia and Malaysia agreed on continental shelf boundaries in 1969, and then Indonesia and Vietnam, I think, in the early 90s. Those lines are, those continental shelf delimitation lines are closer to Indonesia's coastline than they are neighboring states. The reason for this is that Indonesia was very keen to gain acceptance for the idea, the concept of archipelagic states in the negotiations leading to the convention, particularly with Malaysia. What Indonesia has done is issue official mapping of its maritime claims and shows the red lines you can see over here is where Indonesia feels that the water column boundary should lie. So we have a push from Indonesia for different boundaries for seabed versus water column. Now, this map actually needs updating because a couple of months ago, Indonesia and Vietnam reached agreement on an EEZ boundary between them, and it is different in location from the continental shelf boundary, but I haven't actually seen the map. It hasn't been released yet, hasn't been ratified by parliaments on each side. So that's an example of a state being explicit where its maritime claims are and limited by versus its neighbors, where there are overlaps. Many states, I think, are hesitant to do this because there are either concerns technically over the location of baselines, and there are capacity issues about determining baselines along the coast, but also there is a degree of hesitancy in relations with neighboring states of actually saying, here are the limits of my claims. It's very difficult to then claim more than the limit that you've explicitly stated is your claim at a subsequent time. So briefly on sea level rise and why it's a driver. Well, here's a typical Swedish coastline. Hopefully you can all come to Malmö soon and see this. But the concern in the context broadly for sea level rise is that there will be increasing inundation and erosion of the coastline, leading to a retreat in the location of the low water line along the coast, which is our default baseline, the normal baseline along the coast. So that there is a double hit here, a double whammy, in terms of losing land territory, which is where we like to live, where our infrastructure is concentrated, our urbanization, at the same time as potentially losing jurisdiction over maritime space. So if we apply this using that envelopes of arc technique, you have a coastline, you have generating a 200 or a 12-mile limit there, and you may get lucky. Coastlines are dynamic in character. You may get deposition along the coastline, and as a consequence of that idea of an ambulatory normal baseline, you may gain both land territory and maritime space. But the concern in the context of sea level rise is this, that you are losing land territory at the same time as potential maritime jurisdiction and therefore rights over the valuable marine resources within. That also has implications for the status of insular features, whether a feature is truly an island that is above high tide, that is composed of land and surrounded by water, or is a mere low tide elevation, which is covered at high tide. And in terms of the definition between island rock, a rock is a disadvantaged type of island that must be able to support human habitation or an economic life of its own. If it cannot do that, then it's a rock which is denied EEZ and continental shelf rights. The issue there for many coastal states is not necessarily in complete inundation of features, it's whether they become more and more difficult to be inhabited. Saltwater intrusion into the coastal aquifer, loss of potable water, you have features that become less and less habitable and therefore potentially need to be recategorized from fully entitled features to mere rocks, and also potentially, ultimately, being fully submerged. Now, Quentin mentioned Kiribati yesterday, so it's another illustration of this, and truly we are dealing with a small island, but large or big ocean state. You can see the whoops, backwards one, the three island groups, 3 areas of exclusive economic zone, and the way in which you can see ocean on both sides of the single lane roadway. The statistic that really drove it home to me is that resurfacing that roadway took up 10% of the land area of Tarawa. the main island in Kiribati. Highest point on Kiribati at 3 meters. Currently, IPCC is looking at 1.1 meters by the end of this century. However, if you read more closely on the IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that 1.1 meters of sea level rise is based on all of our governments fulfilling the pledges that they've made. If we have a business as usual scenario, it will be of the order of 2 meters by the end of 2100, and by 2150 we're talking about 5 meters, in which case you do have an existential threat for small island states that are low elevation. 90% of Kiribati's exclusive economic zone is dependent on features that are 3 meters or less. You have one high elevation feature, Ocean Island, Banaba. So this is an example of a state that has almost everything to lose in the context of sea level rise. That has driven change in policy. Over time, the Pacific Island states, we've heard about the way they've collaborated cooperatively in fisheries, also in terms of oceans policy, with the overt objective of essentially having what they hold, of keeping their maritime entitlements. Through the Pacific Oceanscape, this is directly indicated as a way to preserve maritime entitlements. We've had a whole series of political declarations from Pacific Islands leaders to this end, and that really culminated in August of 2021 with the Declaration on Preserving Maritime Zones in the Face of Sea Level Rise. That declaration is explicit, and it goes further than any of the political declarations in the past about how the Pacific Islands are going to declare and fix their maritime entitlements. And to give you one example, the Marshall Islands Declaration, we'll come to in a moment. Firstly, there's been huge progress among the Pacific Island states in terms of delimiting the maritime boundaries between them. Maritime boundaries have a privileged position in international law as being essentially permanent. Once agreed, you're going to see no shift in the location of an international maritime boundary. But what states are also doing is overtly depositing material with Doulos in order to fix their maritime entitlements. Marshall Islands Declaration in 2016, the legislation itself is 14 pages long. It's reasonably unremarkable as a refreshed legislation. The declaration is 451 pages long. That's because it's essentially a geographical information systems file turned into text for the purpose of deposit with the UN Secretary General. It provides an enormous list of coordinates to define all baselines, 12-mile limits and 200-mile limits, as well as maritime boundaries with neighboring states. Now, in order to approximate a curve, how we do this in this scenario is to define points and join them up with straight lines. Now, a straight line approximating a curve is a chord. The arc to chord distance in this declaration is no more than 1 meter. To achieve that, you need a lot of points and a lot of coordinates, hence the 451 pages worth of declaration. All of the states whose jurisdictions are outlined in pale blue on that map have made those declarations, have deposited material with the UN Secretary General with the purpose of preserving those maritime claims. Now, the thing is that this challenges that idea that I mentioned at the start of the land dominating the sea. Now, I'm a member, I have to declare, of the International Law Association Committee on International Law and Sea Level Rise, and our 2018 resolution largely reflects that practice on the part of the Pacific Island states, that states should be able to define their baseline limits and boundaries in keeping with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and then not shift those baselines and limits. There is now an ILC, an International Law Commission study group, at the UN General Assembly under the Sixth Committee, which is seeking the viewpoints of the international community on this evolution in treatment of baselines, limits, and boundaries. Because this does challenge that fundamental idea of land dominating the sea. There is a lot of sympathy for threatened, low elevation, small island developing states, but there's also concern over the precedent that this will set. Because essentially this is the idea of what we'll be looking at, because if you freeze the baseline, if you set and fix the baseline, then inevitably you also fix the outer limits defined from that baseline. But if you then have rising sea levels, you potentially have a recession in the physical reality of the coast and a gap opening up between your legally fixed, your legal fiction of where the baseline is, versus the physical reality of the coast. And that is a concern to maritime states. What is the status of those waters between the legal baseline and the physical reality of the coast? One could theorize that it would be likely internal waters, but there are navigational implications to that. Now, from our point of view, this is advantageous because what we're seeing is an increasing trend towards clarifying where the limits are, and therefore that aids us in the determination of which vessels are engaged in legal versus illegal fishing, which jurisdiction are they in. Now, for maritime boundaries, I'll skip through this pretty quickly, this animation, but essentially we have a scenario of a mainland state with baselines along, maybe straight baselines, maybe bay closing lines, low tide elevations. You have an archipelagic state offshore, 12-mile limits, 24-mile limits for territorial sea and contiguous zone, and then exclusive economic zone limits. And oops, that's the scenario that we're seeing globally. And dead easy. All you need to do is draw a line and delimit a maritime boundary where you have an overlap. The reality is that this is more difficult than just illustrated. The courts have moved gradually towards what's described as a three-step process and established, this is from the Black Sea case in 2009, every international case for maritime delimitation since 2009 has employed the three-stage process. First, establish a geometric line, an equidistance line, that shall be drawn unless there are compelling reasons to make that unfeasible. Then to consider the factors that might lead you to adjust that line. And thirdly, to undertake, in my opinion, a fairly fictional test, a disproportionality test. Oddly enough, in every case employing the three-stage method, at the third stage, the judges found that no, they hadn't made a mistake at the testing phase and didn't need to readjust the line. Now, in the Black Sea case, I must admit I didn't become a stamp collector as a kid, but later on it seems that I have become one. In the Black Sea case, a key issue was Serpent's Island, that has become more famous in recent time than for maritime delimitation. And the International Court of Justice ignored the Serpent's Island from the point of view of delimitation of the exclusive economic zone and adjusted the line accordingly. The downside of the three-step process from my point of view as a geographer is that in every single application of it, the judges have exercised their discretion to pick base points, to not use the strict equidistance line, but to actually influence the line from the very first step. But that's possibly an issue for a different presentation. Ultimately, we have a roadmap of sorts of how a court will deal with maritime delimitation, and many negotiations follow the same sort of practice, starting with an equidistance line and then looking at ways to adjust it. The vast majority of maritime boundaries are decided through negotiation rather than going to court, and I will always recommend negotiation because there is still a strong degree of unpredictability about where the line will end up if you go to an international court. What I say to my students is generally you open up an atlas and you see a fairly familiar network of red lines for land boundaries. Of course, that political map evolves over time. Former Yugoslavia, USSR breaking up, emergence of South Sudan, of Eritrea. But we're comfortably familiar with the political map of the world that Quentin decorated with flags yesterday. Offshore, we see a lovely wash of blue. Partially, I think that's because of the different zones, and it's the complexity of trying to depict that on a map. But it's also because the map is incomplete. We're only a little way over halfway for potential maritime boundaries having some form of agreement associated with them. Many of those agreements are partial in character, dealing with only part of the potential length of line, or all the agreements before 1982 were territorial sea and continental shelf only. So we have scenarios like Indonesia and its neighbors where the continental shelf boundary is delimited, but the water column boundary is yet to be agreed. I'm also excluding Caspian Sea from these figures. I'm excluding the outer or extended continental shelf. Now, the submissions related to extended shelf beyond, that is continental shelf rights beyond 200 nautical miles from coast, we have of the order of 37 million square kilometers of submissions to the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, of which 3.3 million square kilometers are overlapping with one another. So even within 200 nautical miles of the coast, we're only a little over halfway there, and we have a whole series of outer or extended continental shelf boundaries also to limit. In short, this is a career for you. There's plenty of work here to get you all the way to retirement and beyond. Now, the problem with these overlapping claims that are yet to be delimited, the potential maritime boundaries that have yet to be agreed, is that this tends to undermine efforts at ocean governance. We tend to zone as a means and to bound areas as a means to manage. And that on land that applies, but also offshore. Where there is uncertainty over who has jurisdiction, and states with, as Professor Hanich indicated, we're still living in a world of Westphalian states. For all the influences of globalization, we're talking about state-led rights over maritime spaces. And that complicates management of marine resources and access to seabed oil and gas, for example. And I'm sorry to tell this audience that essentially oil for policymakers appears to be sexier than fish. Every time I've come across an area of overlapping maritime claims of disputed waters, someone in the media will say, aha, it's oil rich, on the basis of pure speculation. They rarely say it's rich in fisheries, which is often the real resource at stake. Maritime security can be compromised. It can be a threat to international peace and security. The overlapping claims areas can be a source of friction, rather than concerns over black holes in the ocean, ungoverned spaces. For example, the tri-border sea area, Sulu and Sulawesi seas between Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia have been a concern over maritime terrorism, insurgency, maritime security, a focus for that. But an overlapping claims area can also be the most patrolled area. It can be the areas where there is competition between rival fishing fleets and competition between rival enforcement authorities. And South China Sea is a pretty good example of that. Actually, one Attorney General of a Southeast Asian state, and I'll not say who, but she said, well, if you're going to have a marine casualty, if you're going to sink, the best possible place to do it is in the Malacca Strait, in the area claimed by both Malaysia and Indonesia, because they will race in order to try and help you first as an act of administration to prove that they have jurisdiction over those waters. So there is an alternative narrative to the idea of ungoverned spaces. There are obligations under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea regarding those areas pending maritime delimitation, those disputed waters. These are obligations for states to make every effort to enter into a provisional arrangement of a practical nature, and in the transitional period not to jeopardize or hamper reaching final agreement. Now, these are quite aspirational obligations. You don't have to agree, you have to make every effort to do so. But where do these obligations apply? Well, they apply obviously in the area of disputed waters, but states have to make their maritime claims in good faith. So as an example, in the Gulf of Thailand, this is Thailand's 1973 unilateral claim line. When Thailand and Malaysia came to negotiate their maritime boundary, they could agree the territorial sea boundary and the continental shelf boundary out to about 39 nautical miles offshore. Subsequently, because of straight baseline claims by Cambodia and Vietnam on the other side of the Gulf of Thailand, Thailand instituted an additional area of straight baselines, joining up these two small features. And Colocene, I think this podium is slightly taller than Colocene, possibly slightly larger than it. So tiny features joined up by long segments of straight baseline, and Thailand insisted on using those straight baselines as a basis for its negotiations with Malaysia. That produced an overlap that went beyond its previous claim line, and ultimately Malaysia agreed to use the area of overlap, which had been extended by Thailand, as the basis for their provisional arrangement of a practical nature, joint development arrangement focused on oil and gas. Now, you could argue quite strongly that Thailand's claim line, extended on the basis of those excessive straight baselines, is not one made in good faith. And I'm sorry to our Thai friends here in saying that. I'm not picking on you particularly, you're not alone in this type of practice. But that is arguably an example of how excessive claims are encouraged by this process. Now, those obligations make every effort not to jeopardize or hamper. Their obligations essentially of conduct, not of result. But they are obligations that can have teeth. They have implications for what states do in those disputed waters, including fishing activity. There are a couple of cases which are of particular interest here. Unfortunately, they are oil and gas oriented. There's Guyana and Suriname overlap in the Caribbean, and also the Côte d'Ivoire Ghana case. I will say more about Ghana Suriname because it gives more meaningful help in the judgment for our purposes. But the Côte d'Ivoire Ghana case gives you a good example of how states can have a gentleman's agreement, so-called, where the line is, right up until one side finds 6 billion barrels of oil. Then you have a dispute. Now, arbitration case related to Guyana and Suriname was triggered by Guyana leasing offshore exploration blocks in the disputed area. An exploration drilling ship went out into the disputed area, and there was an incident with a Suriname patrol boat that essentially instructed the survey vessel to leave Suriname waters within 12 hours. Now, the outcome of the arbitration was that both sides were in the wrong. On the one hand, Suriname had breached its obligations to negotiate in good faith because Guyana at the last minute had offered to negotiate the issue. And it had also breached its obligation regarding jeopardize or hamper by using the threat of the use of force in an illegal manner. Guyana, in turn, had broken its obligations not to jeopardize or hamper by not informing Suriname, not offering to cooperate with Suriname in the activity, and unilaterally authorizing the exploratory drilling. What's really interesting about this ruling, though, is that the tribunal drew a distinction between what activities you can undertake in disputed waters and what you can't. The frustration for us today is the focus was squarely on oil and gas exploration. So essentially, activities that don't harm the marine environment in a permanent manner are allowable. So you can undertake seismic survey. But if you undertake drilling of the seabed, then you're permanently harming the marine environment, and therefore that would be unlawful. Okay, where does fishing fit into this? We can discuss that in the Q&A, but were a fleet of fishing vessels to go into a disputed area and fish, would that be permanently harming the marine environment? Or would it be, if they're doing so in a sustainable manner, would that be counted as an allowable activity, which doesn't permanently harm the marine environment? And that hasn't been put before an international court or tribunal. So we have an uncertainty here over whether fishing activity in a disputed zone is lawful or it breaks the obligations under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Very briefly, because I'm running against time, it feels like I'm at the UN General Assembly. Fidel Castro famously had, I think, 3 minutes to make his contribution when all world leaders were present, and he took out his handkerchief and laid it ceremoniously over the timer, and then took it off just as he finished his speech bang on time. So I'm trying to do that. Briefly on provisional arrangements of a practical nature. Under Articles 74 and 83, paragraph 3, dealing with continental shelf and exclusive economic zone, there's an obligation on states to make every effort to enter into a provisional arrangement of a practical nature pending agreement. And that phraseology has been taken to be the legal basis of maritime joint development zones. Now, for these zones, generally you need an agreement. You need to specify a particular area whether the practical arrangement will apply. You need to agree with your neighboring state what laws apply within that zone. So including criminal laws. If you have an oil rig within that joint zone and one crew member stabs another, whose criminal law will apply? Whose taxation law will apply? How will the proceeds from the revenues for oil and gas activities or fishing activities actually be divided between states? You also ideally need uncontested sovereignty between the claimant states of the area. So, for example, Korea and Japan entered into an agreement on joint development in the northern part of the East China Sea, not too far from where we are now, in 1974. I've heard one scholar say that this joint zone is wonderfully sophisticated, and it provides for really elegant ways of sharing jurisdiction over subzones within the overall joint area, but it's been a greater source of PhD theses than oil. And this is probably or possibly a good thing, because China also claims a large but undefined part of that joint zone area. So had a discovery been made, that would instantly have become a maritime incident and dispute. What you generally have is without prejudice clauses in those provisional arrangements, so that the legal position of each state is not threatened. Neutral terminology balance can be defined either in association with the delimitation of a boundary, but also in the absence of a boundary, but fundamentally you need political will. These sorts of arrangements go for decades, and as a consequence of that, you need as close relationship with your partner for that joint arrangement to survive beyond each administration in each country. So we have a host of examples to work with, and these are joint zones that are in addition to the delimitation of a maritime boundary, and the ones that are highlighted in green involve fisheries. Most of the joint zones, I think the majority, are oil and gas oriented. But as an example, the joint zone between Australia and Papua New Guinea in the Torres Strait, I think is a really good model for dealing with fisheries. Essentially, you define a protected zone within which there is a moratorium on oil and gas exploration, and the maritime boundary that is defined within the Torres Strait, pretty much all the islands are under Australian sovereignty. If you applied an equidistance line, you would end up with the vast majority of the Torres Strait under Australian jurisdiction. But instead, the seabed boundary enters the protected zone and runs down the middle of the Torres Strait. Then the fisheries zone boundary encircles these islands to the north. So in a way, there's a bifurcation in the seabed versus water column boundaries, and the joint arrangements are squarely focused on fisheries management for the Torres Strait Islander population. Some joint zones, often but not always, are encompassing the area of overlap. And that's where you have a problem where excessive claims are in a sense rewarded by being the basis for a maritime joint development zone, as happened in Malaysia, Thailand. Now, only a few of these joint zones address fisheries. Mostly they address oil and gas. But there are several proximate to us now in the East China Sea. There are limitations to these joint fishing zones. One should welcome them in the sense that they are consistent with international law. They show a degree of cooperation, but they're all flag state based. They're not coordinated. They overlap with one another. They don't encompass the ecosystem as a whole, and some are demonstrably not working. And particularly that between China and Korea, I don't need to tell our KMI colleagues of the thousands of incidents that have taken place of Chinese fishermen going beyond the joint zone and into Korean uncontested exclusive economic zone and territorial sea, leading to violent clashes between Korea Coast Guard and Chinese fishermen. More recently, there's also been to the south of those existing zones, in this area down here, a further joint zone which I found remarkable in 2013 that had been agreed between Japan and Taiwan, because those entities, state or entities, also dispute the Diaoyu Islands, or for the Japanese, the Senkaku Islands, and elegantly they defined a joint zone related to fisheries and fisheries practice and management, which ignores the islands. There's a joint zone with a whole 12-mile arcs defined around the disputed islands. So it's an elegant way to sidestep the sovereignty dispute and actually deal with the matter at hand, which is fisheries management. Finally, because I'm nearly out of time, is some conclusions. We have a proliferation of overlapping maritime claims, potential maritime boundaries. We're a long way short of delimiting the mosaic of maritime boundaries for the full, complete maritime political map of the world. Because we have those numerous overlapping maritime claims, one would hope that states would put more attention on the obligations on them in terms of delineating the outer limits of their maritime claims and their maritime claims versus neighboring states, to give us a clarity for all marine users over where the disputed waters actually are, because we have uncertainty on that factor, and that is problematic from the purpose of our discussions for determining what fishing is actually in whose jurisdiction and therefore illegal or not, under whose legislation. There is an increasing trend towards defining the location of baselines, delineating outer limits and delimiting maritime boundaries, and partially that's driven by concerns over sea level rise, as well as a desire to clarify jurisdiction for the purpose of fulfilling the exclusive sovereign rights within national maritime spaces and therefore rights over fisheries. Because if there was one message that came very clearly through from Quentin's keynote, is that in the Pacific region particularly, it's all about fish. It's all about tuna and tuna-like species, and the percentages of government revenue that are dependent on that single development opportunity that these states have is frightening, in the sense that everything is loaded on to security of jurisdiction over those resources. And potentially we have this scenario with sea level rise of baselines retracting, retreating, losing outlying islands or changing their status, and therefore potentially losing swathes of maritime jurisdiction. And that's why there is a concerted effort within the region to try to secure their existing entitlements. And from a natural justice perspective, I'd say these states have contributed the least towards global climate change, and yet are very much at the front line. And all they are attempting to do is to secure what they already possess. So I don't think this can be characterized as an exorbitant claim. I think there is a lot of sympathy in the international community, but this is an evolving area of the international law of the sea and is as yet unsettled. It has been said that clarifying the baselines, limits and boundaries of coastal states is a low-hanging fruit in the fight against IUU fishing. And I recommend a piece by Aaron Honeyball, which I've given the reference for on this issue. Aaron is an international lawyer. He views this type of issue as a low-hanging fruit, drawing the lines. I think there are capacity issues in terms of the technology, and there are also geopolitical sensitivities about drawing lines in the ocean, particularly claim lines. So I think it's not quite as low-hanging a fruit as it might be, but nonetheless, there is potential here for coastal states to clarify the maritime political map of the world by asserting and depositing and fulfilling the obligations under the Law of the Sea Convention to define location of baselines, limits and boundaries. If states don't do so, they still have the obligation on them to make every effort to enter into provisional arrangements of a practical nature that can involve fisheries cooperation and not to jeopardize or hamper the reaching of a final agreement, which may influence or should influence coastal states in their policy of where fishing fleets operate. According to at least that one tribunal between Guyana and Suriname, and bearing in mind that that decision is only binding on those two states, some activity is possible within disputed waters, but judging the level of activity that would jeopardize or hamper is potentially fraught with risk, and particularly what level of fishing activity would trigger a breach of those obligations. Ultimately, with regard to provisional arrangements of a practical nature, we've got plenty of examples around the world. They have great promise. I'm a little bit of a cynic with regard to them. They're not a panacea. They're not free. They require investment politically, economically, to create a joint management regime and then to maintain it over time so that they have the potential if you enter into a joint arrangement with a neighboring state, to complicate that relationship further and cause more complication and friction between the states concerned, unless they have a strong working relationship between them. And I'll pause at that point. I do like cartoons in my slides, but this one is a good one in relation to sea level rise and does reference fish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clive. We're bang on 10 o'clock, so you're to your word with following in the footsteps of Fidel. But we started a little bit late, so the good news is we've got time for at least one or two questions. So I'd like to open the floor for any questions to Clive there. We have one down the front here. To Mr. Castax-Brit, Martin.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. Just one thing. You may recall that the Malacca Strait was the worst area for piracy and armed robbery at the end of the 1990s, beginning of the 21st century. And one of the facts that the pirates used was the fact that there were not only overlap, but this was always areas of different sovereignties. And one of the things which managed to stop the Malacca Strait issue of piracy was the agreement on haute poursuite, that the countries agreed to that an haute poursuite starting in one country's area could be continued in another country. Do you think that the same thing should be developed in the context of the fight against IUU fishing?
Thank you very much indeed for that question. You're quite right. The Malacca Strait in particular was a hotspot, if you will, for piracy or illegal armed robbery against shipping. There's been very considerable progress in terms of at least coordinated, if not joint, patrols in that area. There are now multiple fusion centers. There's a RECAP initiative for coordinating efforts to improve maritime security, but the overlaps still persist. The hot pursuit element, that degree of cooperation related to hot pursuit, was a huge step forward, because previously they had the situation of one side pursuing a suspect vessel up to the extent of at least their maritime claimed area, and then dropping the pursuit when the vessel entered the neighboring state's uncontested maritime space. So that absolutely is a way forward. There are rules related to hot pursuit under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which can be pursued. Australia has undertaken some of the longest hot is the wrong word in this context. In the sub-Antarctic, we're talking about cold pursuits around Heard and McDonald Island in neighboring the Kerguelen archipelago of France, and there have been treaties related to managing hot pursuit activities between France and Australia that are instructive on this, where each state empowers the other to pursue throughout their maritime jurisdictions. Because the rule on hot pursuit is if you reach the territorial sea of another state, then your crimes are essentially washed away, and the hot pursuit cannot continue. The way in which Australia and France have empowered each other to pursue into the territorial sea of the other state is something of a model in relation to this, because of course the resources for surveillance and enforcement when we're dealing with remote territories, Heard and McDonald Islands are 4,200 kilometers southwest of Perth, in an area where Quentin has actually been to Kerguelen, and he will back me up that 70% of the year it snows. These are hostile waters to try and undertake a hot pursuit. It's incredibly expensive to put assets down there for fisheries surveillance and enforcement. Both France and Australia do, but the maritime jurisdictions are substantial. So this bilateral cooperative treaty to enable hot pursuit into each other's jurisdictions is essential to maximize the benefits of having those assets down there. So in answer, yes.
Thank you, Clive. I think we can just take one quick further question, if there's one. Any burning issues? If not, certainly Clive will be around at the coffee break and available to chat with any of you on issues arising from his presentation. Thank you very much, Clive.
Thank you.